But yeah, thanks for inviting me. And I'm going to do a kind of pretty quick talk through accessibility in UX design. And because it's May the 4th, Star Wars Day, I'm going to try and get some kind of Star Wars stuff in there too. So introduce myself. I'm Rhys Pendred. I'm the lead UX designer with Emerald Works. I live in Edinburgh, Scotland. Emerald Works is a company that produces a number of products, including MindTools, which is a web-based platform for learning and development content with a focus on topics in leadership and management. And that's kind of going to frame the discussion today. So I'm going to talk about accessibility in terms of web-based kind of content. There's obviously UX design can also encompass physical products and services, but this is going to be about accessibility from a web-based kind of context. I think, and I don't know if they're working, that Kim, you were going to try enabling Zoom's auto captions. Talking of accessibility, I think they might struggle with my Scottish accent. I have a not a very strong Scottish accent, but voice recognition software famously struggles with Scottish accents. Oh wow, it is enabled.
Yeah, so we'll see.
We'll see what happens. But also, if I say anything, you know, if you need me to repeat anything at any point, if I mumble or you just don't understand something I said, please just like speak up and let me know. I'm quite happy to repeat myself. So yeah, let's talk about accessibility. So what do we mean when we talk about accessibility in UX design? So you probably, if you're familiar with UX design, you probably hear people talk a lot about accessibility and usability. Accessibility is all about making sure that all of your users can access an equivalent experience. And it's kind of a prerequisite of usability. It's like you can't use something unless you can access it, basically. Usability is more about, you know, giving your users efficient, effective, and satisfying experiences, but without accessibility, they can't even begin to have those experiences. So when I was thinking about this, and this is the first point where we kind of go Star Warsy, and you know, I think I set myself a bit of a task by including the Star Wars thing, but when I was doing this slide, I couldn't help but think of this. I don't know if you saw that there. I'm not for a second suggesting like we should blow up usability and accessibility, and this is a bit of a tenuous link, but you know, there we go. That's the first of the Star Wars things underway. So in user experience design, when we talk about accessibility, we're generally talking about it as a response to accommodating disability. And that's really there for kind of historical reasons, I guess, because of the way that we access web content initially, you know, through kind of computers and things, and making that content accessible to people with disabilities became quite an important thing to do. So when we talk about accessibility in UX design, we're generally talking about it in the context of disability. And something that's happened in recent years is a move in the way that we talk about disability. So previously, when we talked about disability, we tended to use what was called a medical model of disability, which was all about, you know, people having some kind of condition or impairment that affected their ability to do things. So someone would have a lack of sight, they'd be blind, you know, they would lack sight, they wouldn't be able to do things visually, or they would they'd be deaf, and it put the focus on the person, so that it was a lack, that something that they lacked created a disability. And something that's happened recently, which is a really positive change, is that we've moved away from that model to what's called the social model of disability. And the social model of disability says that it's not people that lack things, it's the products and the services that are lacking accommodation for people's disabilities. So people are disabled by barriers that society puts up. If I can't read a transcript of the video you have on your website, that's not my problem, it's a problem with your service or your product. And it's a much more inclusive and kind of empathetic model for disability. So I think it's a really positive thing. And when we talk about disability, broadly they fall into kind of 5 kind of categories, which this is kind of relevant for how we address them. But the kind of disabilities that people face are visual. So the most obvious of that would be being partially sighted or blind, or having poor vision. Auditory, so I mean that could be being hard of hearing, but it could also be something like tinnitus. So that there's various conditions that might affect that. Then we have cognitive, learning, and neurological disabilities. By neurological, I guess we mean stuff like maybe being prone to seizures. Cognitive could be something like ADHD or autism. We have physical, so that could be not having fine motor control, or maybe having no motor control, maybe being paralyzed or limited mobility. And speech, which is becoming, now that we have things like Alexa, speech disabilities can impact people's ability to kind of access products. So these are the kind of disabilities that people face. But really, they're just like the kind of differences that people have. And as I said, it's not people that lack something, it's the products and services that lack a way to support their differences. And that kind of mindset is really important. But in some ways, I think we've got it kind of easy. So if we were to kind of jump into the Star Wars universe, this is another 10-year Star Wars, like, I think I read that there's like supposedly over 20 million species in the Star Wars universe. We've got it easy compared with that kind of setup, but we don't have to accommodate so much difference and variety. Like these guys in the middle, the Jawas, apparently their language uses smell as well as words. And like how would we deal with that? How would we build accessible content that had to kind of take into account smells? And C-3PO, the golden robot guy, he famously says that he's fluent in 6 million forms of communication. So that's not like 6 million languages, it's 6 million forms of communication. God knows what they all might be. It could be dance or whatever, So we've got it relatively easy in that, we're all pretty much the same. We have differences, but it's relatively easy to accommodate those. Just out of interest, I was digging around, and there's like, I think there's a specific number for it. There's apparently 7,151 recognized languages in the world today. So that's ones that have like an ISO code. So I mean, translation can be an aspect of accessibility. So if you're doing captioning or subtitles, increasingly, people will have the option to read in different languages. So moving on from this, how do we make the web accessible? So we do it basically through standards and legislation. I think most of you are probably familiar with the W3C, or the World Wide Web Consortium. They're a national community made up of member orgs, full-time workers, employees, and the public, who work together to kind of produce and develop web standards. They've been around for a long time now. Their first web content accessibility guidelines were published back in 1999. So that was shortened to WCAG. You'll hear this term mentioned quite a lot, but that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And WCAG 1, I think, was drafted in 1999. And this is a set of guidelines that set out how to make the web accessible. There's also some other similar kind of standards. The USA in particular has the American Disability Act and Section 508, which refer to kind of, I think 508 refers to kind of federal bodies, so they have to comply to that But the other way, other than standards, then is legislation, and various countries have introduced legislation to enforce the standards. Initially, in most cases, this has been for kind of public bodies and government bodies. The W3C themselves have a table on their site that lists all the countries that have legislation. It's a little bit out of date, but it lists 39 countries that have legislation, mostly based on WCAG, but legislation that's in place. So for example, in Europe, we had the 2016 EU directive, which meant that government bodies, public bodies had to produce accessible, they had to meet a standard for accessible content, which broadly matched WCAG 2.1, which I think came out around 2000. Well, WCAG 2.0 was 2008, so sometime after that. And one of the things about WCAG is it has different levels of compliance. You'll hear this quite a lot as well. So you can either comply at A, AA, or AAA. Most people tend to aim for AA compliance. So that's pretty accessible, but not completely. And most of the legislation that exists is also in line with WCAG AA. And we'll get on to what that means in a little bit. But coming up in Europe, and sadly UK is no longer part of Europe, but I think we'll be following this legislation. There's the 2019 EU Accessibility Act, which applies the same kind of legislation, but to everybody. So any product or service that's put on the market in Europe after 2025 will have to meet the same standards, and that's going to be a really important thing. Interesting, and maybe we can pick it up in the discussion. When I was looking at the table of legislation, I could see anything for any African nations, which surprised me. And I don't know if that's just because the table's out of date. But it'd be interesting to chat with you guys at the end and see if you know otherwise, because yeah, on the W3C site, certainly there's no African nations listed in the legislation section. So I'm going to take a closer look at what WCAG means and some of the guidance. So central to it, there's 4 principles. There is an acronym to try and remember these, but they're not. It's not the snappiest set of principles, but the 4 principles are that content should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And this applies to web content, user agents, and the tools that we use to author. I'm going to go through each of these in turn because they're a little bit opaque. But if you read the WCAG guidance, and I really, if you haven't, recommend you do. It's best source for this kind of stuff. It does need a bit of interpretation. It's quite dense, but it's really worth a read. You'll see these terms used a lot. They're the 4 overarching kind of principles, and I'm just going to go through them all now. So perceivable, WCAG states this as that information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. I mean, that's fairly obvious. It just means you need to, if you're presenting something, the user needs to be able to perceive it. So if you're, whether that's through visual presentation or audio presentation or whatever means, if the user can't even perceive the thing that you're trying to convey, then you're onto a loser. And they give a series of kind of ways in which you can meet this. And some of these you might be familiar with. So like one of the most common ways that people maybe get an introduction to accessibility issues is alt text. So I don't know, most of you have probably heard of alt text, that images on the web should have alt text. So the alt attribute is an attribute for the HTML image element, which provides a description of the information contained in a picture. And it's there so that people who can't see or don't want to see images have an alternative way of accessing that content. And it's quite easy to get it wrong. A lot of people make mistakes when they're creating alt text. It's a bit of a science. There's actually companies who specialize in producing alt text content for you. But really, it's not that complicated. I think people just get tied up in knots. Really, it just needs to describe the information, not describe the picture. It shouldn't be editorialized. You shouldn't be like expressing opinions. And you don't need to do it if it's a decorative image. But yeah, it's kind of it's an important thing. So that's the sort of text alternative. Other ones that you're probably familiar with are things like captioning and things like audio description for multimedia. So audio description is where you provide an audio commentary of what's happening in a visual. Hi, someone.
I was just waving to say bye.
Oh, you got to jump.
Off.
Oh, yeah. No worries.
All right. Great meeting you. I'll catch up on the recording now.
Okay.
So, see you guys.
Cheers. Yeah, so things like audio description or other ways that you can present the content without losing the meaning. So jumping back into Star Wars world, this made me think of an issue about holograms, because this is really central to the story in Star Wars. There's like this hologram of Princess Leia that explains the whole kind of plot line. It's like, how would you make a hologram accessible? I mean, a hologram is like a 3D projection with volume. You could probably do an audio description for what was happening. It might be a little bit odd, but then I thought, how would you do subtitles for a hologram? Because you can look at a hologram from any angle. I don't know, there's a bit of a challenge there. I don't know. Maybe you could have the subtitles in some kind of ring that rotates around the hologram, or I don't know. It's an interesting kind of thought experiment. Who knows? Maybe we'll be using holograms at some point in the future, and will we make them accessible? Another way that the perceivable principle gets applied is color contrast, and that's rules around how much contrast there should be between the foreground and the background for something like text or even UI elements. And WCAG 2.0 lays out guidelines on how much color contrast there should be as a ratio. So, black text on a white background has a very high color contrast. Red text on a black background, less so. And that made me think of this famous UI element from I think it's called the trench run in Star Wars. I should say I am not a huge Star Wars fan, but I have, like I said, I've seen the films. These are the bits I remember. But this scene where they're flying along a trench in the Death Star and they have to fire their torpedoes at a certain point. It's one of the things I thought of when I was thinking about this, and I kind of thought, how much color contrast is there in that readout there? Black background with red text, that's kind of hard to see. So I thought, well, let's check it. There's a number of tools you can use day to day to check color contrast if you're authoring. There's one that I use by a company called TVGI. It's a little piece of free software you can download. There's plenty of websites that do this kind of stuff as well. A lot of tools have color contrast checkers built in. But anyway, I thought I would run it on this and see what happened. And wow, it failed. So you can see on the right here, there's this kind of, that color on that background fails WCAG 2.1 on all counts. Fails as a UI component, fails as regular text or large text. There's not enough color contrast. Someone might struggle to see that. And I guess, you're going to want to see that. I can see why Luke might use the Force in this thing, because he's not going to be able to read that display, depending on the light. But obviously, this is like a fictional thing. It's not real, and it's a photograph of a display, and maybe the actual display in the cockpit was much more legible. I don't know. But when it comes to building web applications, color contrast is really important. It's really important that you think about color contrast for text, but also for UI elements. And like I said, there's plenty of tools that help you check that kind of stuff out. And that relates to the perceivable principle. So moving on to the second of those principles, that's operable. Operable is about the user interface and components and navigation must be operable. You must be able to use them. And I guess a kind of hangover from the way the internet has evolved is one of the main ways that we kind of address this is by ensuring that everything is keyboard operable. So that's a big success criteria for this, is that a website, you should be able to navigate an entire site using your keyboard alone. And that's really important for a few reasons, because one, some people can't use a mouse because maybe they have some kind of disability that affects their motor control, or they might, for whatever reason, they might not be able to use the mouse and they might only want to use a keyboard. So if they can't do things like tab through all your fields in your form, or, they're going to get completely lost. So it's one of the things that we do on a day, is make sure that all our web applications are keyboard navigable. And also quite a lot of voice controlled software effectively uses keyboard navigation as a way of navigating the page. So it's a really important one. Other things that apply to this would be giving users enough time to read and use content. So making sure you don't have content that automatically scrolls, or if it's an audio, that it doesn't play automatically and that there's not some way of kind of controlling it. Helping users to navigate and find content as well is important for making a system kind of operable. And then, although it should be keyboard navigable, it's also important that people can use other ways of inputting stuff without a keyboard. So it goes both ways on that. The third of the principles is understandable, and that's information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable. And this is really about making sure that your content is readable, predictable, consistent, and can be comprehended. So it encompasses a whole bunch of things. So it could be the kind of reading age of your content, making sure that your language isn't overly complicated or has jargons, stuff like that. If you're using abbreviations, that they're expanded. Also that your UI is predictable and consistent, so you do things in the same way, and also predictable in a larger sense, in that you kind of follow convention. So you do things in the way that the user would expect them to be done, that they're done on other sites or other applications. And then the fourth of the founding principles is robust, and that is content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. A user agent, just if you're not sure what that means, is any software that acts on behalf of a user, that retrieves, renders, and facilitates end user interaction with web content. So it's basically a browser. Your browser is a user agent. Any kind of automated software that crawls the web is also a user agent. If you've got a PlayStation 5 and you're browsing the internet on that, it's a user agent. And what's important about this principle is that making sure that no matter changes in kind of technology and as user agents evolve, that your content should remain accessible. There'd be no use if suddenly some new device becomes the way that we all access the internet and all the content is no longer accessible. That would be terrible. So you're just trying to kind of future-proof stuff. So that's the four principles that WCAG 2 and onwards kind of enshrine. Really recommend that you kind of, if you've not looked at WCAG, go and have a look at it. There's a lot of stuff in there, and there's a lot of articles across the web interpreting it, but it's really the best place to go to get an overview of all this stuff. So how do we do this stuff? Like, how do we do it? I think first step is education, about educating yourself. Become familiar with the guidance. If it's relevant to you and what you do, become familiar with the legislation. Educate your team make sure they understand what's involved, educate your colleagues. And then you can also build your processes to kind of encapsulate some of this stuff. So in our team, we have some things like our definition of done for a prototype, for example. We expect everyone to have checked the color contrast of the UI and any text. We consider things like tab order, if it's a form field, if we've got headings, we'll make sure that we're adhering to like proper heading structures. So you can kind of build processes that kind of enshrine some of these principles. And then through tools, many of the authoring tools we use have got accessibility features built in to let you audit the accessibility of your site. Most browsers now have some have tools like the inspectors where you can check color contrast, for example. But there are also dedicated tools that will conduct like an audit of your website. Tools like Accessibility or Site Improve. There's hundreds of them that will do this kind of stuff. They'll run a report on your site and flag up. There's plugins for your browser that will do this kind of stuff, like Wave and a bunch of other ones. I can put together a list of things like that if people want. But then you can also involve third parties. So there's organizations that will come in and conduct an audit of your application or your website, and tell you what's wrong with it, if there's anything wrong. Like in the UK, there's the Royal National Institute for the Blind do this kind of service, and ourselves at Emerald, we used a company called AbilityNet, who are a charity. And we actually got them in on our most recent project to give a series of classes to the whole team, which over several weeks went through this stuff in quite a lot of detail and got everyone kind of up to speed on the basic kind of principles with some really good examples. And as well as that, they have users with accessibility issues who will come and look at your site or your web app and give feedback on it. So that's a really valuable thing. But all these things kind of need to happen together. Any of them on their own, you're probably going to miss things. I mean, I think as a minimum, get educated and then look into what other processes, tools, and then the third parties thing is probably, that's probably needs to happen at a scale. I mean, it's not something you can maybe afford to do if you're working, if you're working for yourself or if you're a freelancer or something, but at a bigger level, it's definitely something that's worth doing. So why would you do it? Well, here's 4 good reasons for doing it. First of all, it's the right thing to do. Why should some people not be able to access your content just because they have a disability? It's ethically, it's the right thing to do to make sure that everyone has access. Quality of access, but inclusivity, they're important things. And that also means that you'll have more users. I mean, apparently there's something like 1 billion disabled potential users in the world. Why would you shut them out from using your application? The more users, the better. You might save money. I mean, so in America, there have been several kind of high-profile cases where companies have been sued because they didn't make their site or their application accessible. But there's other ways that you might save money. If you have a workforce and some of them become disabled, wouldn't it be better if they were able to continue to use the kind of software and products and websites that they used to use, and that they're not suddenly unable to use them because they're disabled? So why rehire people for that reason? And then fundamentally, if we make accessible products, we make better products. Making something accessible benefits everybody. The kind of famous example is subtitles. Subtitles were developed for people who weren't able to hear, but so many of us now use subtitles in all different kinds of situations. It benefits everybody. You know, it's like if you want to mute but still know what's going on, or if you're working in a noisy environment, there's all kinds of reasons. If you want to learn another language, subtitles can be really useful. Same with color contrast. Making things have a sufficient color contrast benefits everybody. If you're working in low lighting conditions, or if there's glare, or if you're working on a small screen, if we make sure that those kind of standards are adhered to, then it benefits everyone. You're going to make a better product, basically. So I think that's it. And yeah, you all deserve a medal for having sat through that slightly chaotic thing. And I have to apologize about the Star Wars thing. There wasn't that much Star Wars in it. It was a bit of a Jedi mind trick to kind of get people to come along and maybe hear about accessibility, which is such an important issue. And if it worked, and some of you came who might not have come otherwise, then that was worth it. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. It's been really nice to be invited. Hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion now. I put my LinkedIn at the bottom there. I'm sure Kim can share that with everybody. I'm really happy to kind of chat or meet up with anyone. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Rhys. It's really good. If anyone has any questions, maybe we can unmute yourself or raise your hand. I think. Yeah. Raising your hand is the best if there's a bunch of people with questions. Let's see. I guess a question to kick things off is, would you say, you know, there's like the 80-20 rule. If you do like 20% of the things, you can have like 80% of the impact. What would be the biggest things if you're trying to get your website or your app up to speed?
Like the kind of low-hanging fruit, kind of. I mean, things like well-formed HTML, so properly structured HTML. And that's maybe more of a developer, front-end developer QA kind of issue, but it's something like if you're designing forms or whatever, you know, and you're using heading levels on a page or whatever, if you're creating layouts like that, stick to the correct implementation of kind of structure, so that when people come to build it, you know, that, you know, we can help developers build content that meets those kind of things. So, you know, or even indicating tab order as part of your design, so that when the developers come to build it, you know, you're not just relying on them doing the right thing, but you know, be involved in dialogues with that kind of stuff. That's relatively easy. The color contrast is a really big one. That's quite, you know, should be picked up at the point where you're prototyping. If you're building a design system or something, you know, you want to make that needs to be in there right from the start, because it's really expensive to try going back and fix something like that. And you shouldn't be like producing prototypes or designs that don't, you know, pass. I mean, we still have, I mean, it's an issue with us occasionally. A design will slip through and there'll be something that doesn't quite meet that. But again, it's expensive to go back if it gets built and you have to come back into design or whatever. It's expensive. Better to sort it out first time. Things like, a lot of these things are probably not maybe in the UX design flow. So alt text, you know, it's arguable whose responsibility that is. If you have a content team, it's probably up to them to kind of make sure that, but you know, you can be involved in it if you're doing any kind of user testing or stuff, you know, good to get that kind of thing out of the way. And I guess, yeah, something like WebAIM, Chrome plugin that you can run pages through and it'll at least flag up the big issues is worth doing.
Awesome. Yeah, I guess something a bit about like there's these automated tools, but there's still, you need like a person sometimes to run through some of those checks, those accessibility checks. Like you can't automate it all.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really important to get someone who understands the issues to kind of check over stuff as well as those automated tools. It's very easy for things to kind of slip through.
Yeah, for sure. John, you've got a question?
Yeah, see, I'm unmuted, right? Can you hear me, right?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I wanted to ask, apart from the usability, the accessibility guidelines that you have for assessing something will work, do you also consider maybe things that you might, maybe the guidelines might miss by doing usability testing? Like if, let's say, you get a certain number of individuals, you test your product, and then maybe things that were not considered in the guidelines end up showing up in the usability testing. Is that also part of the process? May I have that? Yeah.
So I guess that would probably tend more to be usability rather than accessibility issues.
Yeah.
So we've got a kind of our process. We generally try and do some usability testing with everything at some point, but we use small group. So we maybe test with the optimum, I think, is about 5 users. You're going to surface like 90% of the issues if you test with about 5 people for usability issues. I guess accessibility issues can also arise out of how you're doing user testing. So, you know, you might not have considered something, or it could be something that slipped by. It could be particular to whatever kind of application or environment you're building it in. There might be some accessibility issues. I guess at that point, maybe it becomes, the line can get a little bit blurred between what's a usability issue, what's an accessibility issue.
I guess it comes back to your image earlier of accessibility being like a subset of usability.
Yeah, so that point around accessibility is making sure that all of your users have an equivalent experience. So it's not the same experience, because, you know, if I can't see text and I have to listen to an audio transcript of text or something, or I have a screen reader read it out to me, I'm not getting the same experience as someone who's reading it, but I am getting an equivalent experience.
Yeah. One more question before I let others. So okay, I wanted to ask something that's related to like the stakeholders, like business. So if, let's say, they want to release like a minimum viable product, and I'm pretty sure whenever you're releasing a minimum viable product, they'll be like, okay, the product at least needs to have the bare minimum features or bare minimum accessibility before you release it. Like, are there usually like conversations about, okay, we can include this accessibility, or we'll leave this out, and maybe in version 2 we'll add this later? Does that, you have to make certain compromises, but you have to fight for certain things to be more important? Like, okay, we need to have subtitles and this, we can't.
Sure.
Yeah. Like, what's the hierarchy of what goes and what stays?
So that, I mean, that's interesting. So, and that maybe makes me think of the point I made around when I was talking about legislation and how WCAG and W3C's table of legislation didn't reflect any African nations, which I don't know if that is the case, but definitely in the UK, especially if you're partnering up with government bodies, public bodies, there's a real, or increasingly even just like other partners will expect you to produce and have an accessibility statement and to conform to WCAG AA. And if your product doesn't, you're probably going to run into problems. So people expect you to hit those standards, and come 2025, that's going to apply to every product, even stuff outside of the public sector or government. So that's a really big motivator. I guess if you're working in a situation where that kind of legislation isn't a factor, it might be harder to convince people that you need to build in accessibility right from the start. But I think the cost of trying to refactor it in is prohibitive, and if you put it off and say we'll do it for release 2 or whatever, it's most likely it's not going to happen. you know, because it will just get kicked down the road, I guess. So I think I would try and push really strong. And also, if you can build on the case of, you know, by making something accessible, you benefit everybody. It's not just about catering to a minority. It's about building a better product. So, for an example of subtitles, you know, you're not just doing that for people who can't hear. It gives your sighted users another option, another way of consuming content. And yeah, there are costs involved in it, but increasingly the costs for that kind of stuff are getting lower. It's like, you know, some, you know, so like the call, I didn't see any of the auto translation or whatever that was happening. I don't know how good a job it did, but it was like free services that will do that kind of stuff now as well, or generate transcripts and things for you. So cost shouldn't really be an issue, but yeah. So I don't know, can anyone comment on the situation in Zimbabwe, maybe, for, you know, in terms of legislation around accessibility? Is anyone aware of anything?
Okay. I'm not fully. I would have to ask maybe what's in line. Maybe she's familiar, but I don't really experience any push for that, at least from a government level or legislation level. But I will say that the fact that it actually happens, like, you know, where they actually push for accessibility, I think it also at least gives, I guess, especially, I'm guessing if there's no accessibility, it's an issue, right? Is it like a penalty, or maybe the product won't get approved by, like, is there like a penalty for not?
So I think in terms of for in the UK, I think for government stuff, if, you know, they won't commission work if you know, it'll be a failure on the contract if something's produced for a government body and it doesn't hit AA, WCAG 2.1 AA, you know, that's a reason for kind of not paying up, is my understanding. And then in terms of what will happen when it's widened out to affect everybody, I think it would be I mean, how effective it will be, I don't know, but I think there'd probably be fines in place, and, you know, I'm not sure what kind of level they'd operate, but it opens the door to being sued as well, or someone bringing like a kind of
so basically there's a legal incentive to actually have accessibility.
Yeah.
Okay,
and it ties in, you know, with people's right to, you know, so it's quite a big deal. It's taken quite seriously here in terms of.
Okay, makes sense. So okay, the fact that it's taken seriously means that it's something you would never skip.
Yeah, and I think America has a whole
designers.
Yeah, America has its own kind of legislation.
Yeah, an incentive to like make sure that, you know, it is accessible. So I don't know. I just think if the government or if legislation is involved, I think it will also give designers a prerogative to not out.
Yeah, I feel like in the UK, it's almost like if you opened a physical retail store and there wasn't wheelchair access,
you could be sued.
Like, yeah, so like in the digital, if you had a digital store, a digital site, they're getting to a point where it's equivalent to something like that. It's just, you wouldn't do it kind of thing. All right, I see we got a question. We got two hands up. I think Adley, you had your hand up first.
Hi, Adley.
Okay, thanks. Hi. So my question is there a guideline or some sort of rules that guide UX designers in the testing phase of developing a product to say you should include so much of people who are potentially going to be representing the disabled population? Because I remember you mentioned there's about 1 billion people in the world who are considered disabled.
Sure.
Does that mean maybe you should consider maybe 1 in 8 people to be representing that disabled group in your testing phases?
I haven't come across any kind of rules that would say, you know, there's a certain kind of quota of users that you should include, but I think it's probably a good idea to include some. I know that's a bit vague, but because yeah, but if you don't get feedback from someone who actually has a disability, it can be quite hard to know if you're implementing your accessibility properly. So one example is screen readers. I don't know if anyone has any experience of how a person using a screen reader, what it's like. I mean, you've maybe come across screen readers reading text and other kind of things. I don't know if you use TikTok and they do their automatic text generation thing, you know. But if someone using a screen reader is like a completely different experience to how you might think. The speed that they get their screen readers to actually read and the keyboard shortcuts that they use to navigate around the page while, you know, the screen reader is reading stuff is so different to what you might expect. Is a really it's like a shocking kind of experience to see someone. If you sit alongside someone while they're doing it, it'd be like, whoa, how are they taking all that information in so quickly? Because they'll be like skipping through all the heading levels and, you know, but it's a skill they develop. But so, you know, you might think you've made your site accessible by screen reader, but unless you get someone who actually uses one to do it, you know, there's some issues you're not going to find. So I think, yeah, if you can get some users in, great. It's not always easy to do, and I don't know if there's any kind of hard and fast rules about what percentage or how many you should. It's probably something worth looking up. I don't know the answer off my top of my head. I would just like try and involve. It can be hard to do as well. You know, if you're in a small team, you might not have access to, but there's plenty of charities will be quite happy to put you in touch with users as well. So, you know, it could be that the kind of amongst your stakeholders or your users, you've not got anyone, but I think if you can get in touch with charities, they're quite often more than happy to kind of provide users to use in your testing because it benefits everybody.
Actually, it's a good question because I actually saw something today, oddly enough, where teams that aren't used to developing products with usability in mind can actually include personas. You know how we develop personas at the beginning of our projects. So you can actually add a persona of someone with someone of determination. So you always have that at the back of your mind that you're building products, not just for your typical able-bodied personas, but you can throw in a persona in there that's of determination.
Sure, and that's probably a good idea. In fact, probably rather than have like, this is our disabled persona, just kind of blend that in amongst your personas so that, you know, that your personas, you know, it's not a special disabled persona, it's just a persona that happens to have, I don't know, you know, a visual impairment, or that's probably a great idea. Exactly. I've got kind of mixed feelings about personas. I'm struggling with a thing with personas at work at the moment, but you know, I think personas can be really useful, and that's probably that's a really good use case for if you don't have access to people that actually experience these issues, then you can at least try and, you know, empathize with them through the use of tools like personas.
Nice. Titch, I see you had a question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you're a bit faint, but we can hear you.
I think my question is more around, to what extent is it the designer's responsibility to cater for the disabled versus something like the government's responsibility to enable people? Because like if something is on a digital medium, it's like musicians will end up being sued for not making the content accessible to deaf people, whereas the state might be responsible for making more hearing aids and that sort of stuff available. Like, are there any guidelines on to what extent people are responsible for making things accessible?
That's a good question, and I kind of think, yeah, I can't help thinking there's something wrong with the idea that, like, if you look at, you know, I don't think it's equivalent to like musicians aren't catering to deaf people, because actually, like most people who are deaf or most people who are partially sighted aren't completely deaf or aren't completely blind, and people can experience music in different ways as well. So, you know, there are plenty of deaf people, musicians, in fact, and people who can experience music through, through the rhythm or the vibrations from, there's a very famous percussionist in the UK who's deaf, for example. She's like a classical percussionist. So I think it's wrong to kind of think in those terms, but actually when it comes to whose responsibility is it, I think it's everybody's responsibility to try and be inclusive and not exclude any one part of society. I think government's role, this is getting out of UX and into kind of politics, I guess, is kind of like the government's role is to kind of provide the legislative framework or something, or maybe that's not the government's role, maybe that's the legislators law. I don't know, I can't even say the word, but government probably has to pass laws that then get kind of applied, I guess. But I think fundamentally it's wrong to not try and be inclusive. And I think it's so like, yeah, I don't know. Has anyone else got thoughts on that? I think it's an interesting point.
So from what I've seen, I would say the people building the product are responsible, because a lot of the times your stakeholders and maybe your clients or whatever have no clue how to make a digital product especially accessible, right? Because it's not their forte, right? So it's essentially it's up to us who are building it.
Sure.
I would even go as far as saying it's up to us that are designing it, because a lot of the times I've seen developers are also in that same boat where when they're writing code, they don't necessarily think of how to make the code they're writing more accessible, right? Because they just focus on delivery. So I would say the onus is on us as the designers to really champion the idea of inclusivity. For sure.
And I think Kim's comparison with like an architect building a shop and not designing wheelchair access, you wouldn't blame the builders for not having built a ramp. You would say it was the architect should have considered that, and in that sort of sense we're the architects maybe.
Exactly. And if we build in accessibility in our design systems, then it kind of filters down to development as well, because we can guide them as to how to actually implement some of these concepts within the code.
Sure. And in the same sense, the recurring thing is that it benefits everybody. So like a ramp doesn't just benefit people with wheelchairs, it benefits people with prams, pushchairs, or someone who's just a bit tired, or I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I use the ramp every time I walk into my building because I just want to climb up those 2 stairs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes it's surprising ways, right? Like, I don't know if people thought before like subtitles came along, but like I think I would say most people probably watch videos with subtitles on now and the volume off, and people might not have even predicted that 10 years ago. So.
Yeah, that's a good example. So we launched our product in Feb, and part of our marketing team's contribution was developing a launch video, right? And our chief marketing officer, right, the top of the end in our organization for marketing, when he was talking about deploying this video on social, etc. Because I build products and I know about accessibility, and like you said, Kim, people watch these videos muted. I asked him the question, like, how we put subtitles. Then he's like, oh, actually, we didn't think of that. And because they come from like traditional media where that was never really an issue. So even for people that are senior to us, senior stakeholders, it's good for us to remind them about these issues because they might not be living it. So it might be an oversight sometimes.
Yeah, I guess because in UX, our focus is on the user. We quite often, we're more aware of some of these issues than other parts of the business. And then our role becomes to kind of advocate for the user. And that includes things like accessibility.
That's awesome. Batsy, did you have an additional question?
Yes, I did.
Cool.
So something I've been thinking of, just was wondering what everyone thinks. So a lot of the concepts we've been talking about really relate more to Web 2. So I was wondering, Rhys, how do you think accessibility will look like in Web 3? Especially with virtual like realms like the sandbox and virtual reality, and how do you think that will play out?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because something like the metaverse or VR kind of environments, you think, wow, how are we going to make that accessible? Because it's such a visual medium.
Exactly.
I mean, but that's maybe just blinkered thinking. I don't know. It's like because you know, there's such things as like spatial audio exists. You know, there's all kinds of haptic feedback and stuff. So maybe it's just like there's solutions we haven't even thought of yet. I mean, I think like the move towards voice interfaces is really interesting, because, you know, if you've got issues with vision or hearing, well, obviously if you've got issues with hearing, voice activated stuff is a problem. but if you have speech issues, you know, and so we need to start thinking, how do we accommodate that? So, you know, digital assistants like Alexa and stuff, you know, what's the accessibility issues that they kind of throw up? I don't know if they count as Web 3. Probably not. Yeah, I think it's probably good to start thinking about that stuff before it happens, because otherwise it's going to take us a bit like it did with the internet. It's going to take us Web 1 or whatever. It's going to take us a long time to kind of catch up. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, one thing like VR headsets, and some people, they just get like seasick wearing them. So
yeah, well,
everyone in your office decided now we're having all our meetings in VR.
Yeah,
and like those people would get left out, or what would they do? Yeah.
So that's increasingly a kind of an issue with accessibility. Is people are susceptible to motion sickness. So some people will find those kind of parallax scrolling kind of and stuff that you see on sites. Some people find that very disorientating, and those kind of transitions and animations. And, you know, so there's a growing, I think there's some kind of rules around you should be able to disable those kind of animations and transitions on the site, because, you know, for some people it makes them really ill. And yeah, VR, amount of people who get kind of motion sickness in VR. But yeah, I don't know. I find the whole VR thing, I had a VR helmet for a while, and it's just like so weird. I can, you know, it cuts you off from the world so much. It's still in kind of early days, even though it's been around for a while. But yeah, it's increasingly being adopted. Our company, in fact, one of the teams in the company that do custom work are investigating using the metaverse at the moment. But I'm not sure what accessibility issues they're going to face.
Interesting.
Yeah, because some of these things are browser based, right? So for example, if users are exploring, for example, I'll give you some examples. So Dubai just launched some a government center in the sandbox. I think this happened like this week. And some companies here, I think even Nike, they're launching like virtual branches on like the sandbox or the metaverse, right? And these are currently all browser based. So how do you make something that is almost like a game, I would say? How do you make that accessible beyond, because you can't obviously use a screen reader for that.
Sure. So I guess
right.
It comes back to that they need to have an equivalent experience, and maybe that would be a more traditional browser-based version that is then accessible via screen reader. So, you know, if it's some kind of virtual pardon me, Nike store that you can go into and you can look at shoes, then there's more traditional ways you could convey the same information, I guess. So it's probably that kind of, yeah, providing an equivalent experience, I guess. I mean, one of the things that happens with at the moment, where sites have to have an accessible in Europe for that legislation around accessibility, is that you're supposed to hit WCAG 2.0, but where you can't, you're supposed to have an accessibility statement that says what you will do where things don't meet that standard. And that might be that you provide a phone number that someone can phone up and get the information, or it might be that someone can write a letter and you'll give them a response, or it's that kind of thing, because it tends to focus on kind of government. But that's the kind of the minimum. That's not, the ideal is that you have an equivalent experience. But yeah, I don't know how that works for kind of virtual world stuff.
It's really interesting. Well, I see we've gone past the hour. So if anyone wants to drop off, that's great. Or feel free. I'm happy to hang around for a bit longer. If anyone just wants to chat some more. I'm not sure if there are any questions, but I'll just say thank you so much, Rhys.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Sorry if I kind of, sorry for the kind of the not much Star Wars content. I did wear a Star Wars t-shirt that actually says Star Wars, but
yeah. No, I think it was a nice level, and you did a good job with a tough challenge. So it was really great.
Yeah, I'd really like to continue to kind of be in touch with you guys. I'd love to come any future, some kind of stuff, and I think it's really nice having a community like this.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
So I am going to drop off because I've got something happening. So cool. Thank you all so much for coming. It was a real pleasure.